Hey everyone, my name's Brant Moore and this is my brake check. So for the past couple years I've been making a lot of tips and tricks videos relating to BMX brakes, how to make them better, how to make them more efficient, how to make things last longer, and I realized that I've done all of these videos but I don't have one singular place where I talk about all of them and go through everything that I have on my bike. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to run from the top all the way to the back through my brake setup, telling you everything that I use and talking about all of the different tricks that I've done to make my cables last longer and make my brakes work better. So with that being said, as I go through my brake setup and talk about the different tricks that I've done and things that I use in my setup, I will link corresponding videos in info cards on whichever corner of the screen that they're in so that you can watch those videos and learn how to do these things for yourself. And without any further delay, let's get right into the brake check. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is my brake lever. I've got the Odyssey Monolever in medium, and then when it comes to my cables themselves, I've got my own custom cable design where I have a dual upper cable that uses the Snafu Astroglide cable piece that goes onto the barrel adjuster of the Odyssey Monolever. I've got a video on how to do that with Snafu Astroglide cables or other cables with similar connecting pieces for the two dual upper cables. And like I said, I've got my own design that I use on the upper cables where it has one single cable inner that goes up through one side cable starting at the gyro, goes up through the cable piece that comes from a Snafu Astroglide cable. The brake cable comes through there and it loops through the brake cable where the cable end would normally go, and it has a little piece that I made that it loops through, which I'm probably showing right now, and then it goes down the cable on the other side and into the other side of the gyro with no cable ends necessary. And the way that this works is that I have a gyro with set screws in it so that you don't need cable ends technically. It's still better to have them sometimes to be safe, but I don't use them, and the reason that I do this is because I got tired of breaking cables in the middle of a session at the skate park or wherever and not having extras. And I realized that if I came up with this single cable inner design, I could replace my upper cables without having to buy cables. I could just have a cable inner, cut it in half, and get two uses out of one cable inner. And speaking of the cable inners, for all of my cables that I'm going to be talking about, my cable inners are 1.6 millimeter normal brake cable inners. So it's a thicker version of what you'd normally find, and I find that these hold up longer. So my upper cables have one singular inner cable in them that's connected by a gyro, an Odyssey GTX gyro with the screws in it that they don't make anymore. They make a version without screws. Either way though, the two ends of the single cable are connected to the gyro by the set screws, and this is what allows you to have a single inner dual upper gyro cable setup. One quick thing that I wanted to throw in here about my gyro and upper cable setup is that this single inner design using the set screws allows you to position your gyro anywhere between your gyro plate and your gyro tabs that you want to, which is ideal because ideally you do want your gyro floating between this point so that the bottom isn't touching the gyro tab and the top, when pulled all the way tight, doesn't touch the gyro plate. If it touches the gyro plate when it's all the way tight, that means that it's probably not pulling as hard as it could because something is stopping it before it gets to that point. So with this single inner cable design, you don't have to worry about any of that because you can position the gyro anywhere that you need to without having to worry about slack in the top cables, which sometimes you do have to worry about with stock upper gyro cables that are a set length and you have to adjust out or put in spacers or figure something out to get the gyro in the right place, which can be a huge pain to figure out when with this setup you put it where it needs to go and you don't have to worry about anything else because it's in the right place from the start with no adjustment to make that happen. And with that being said, we can move down past the gyro into the lower cable setup that I have. And the first thing that you might notice here is that I have these silver metal pieces on my brake cables, and then my cables are connected down lower on the down tube of the frame. These silver pieces, if you didn't already know, are called V-brake noodles, and their purpose is to give you a more rigid place for your cable inner to go through on the bend to get up into the bottom of the gyro. Without the V-brake noodles, normal cables have to bend at a 90-degree angle, which can put strain on your inner cable and make for friction. And with brakes, friction means not as smooth of a pull, and that's just annoying to me. So I have these V-brake noodles, which are made of metal, which is rigid, so the cable goes through them and there's no friction being put on the inner cable itself whenever it's being pulled. Another purpose of these is to require less cable housing to make your outer cable for the lower gyro cable setup. So you can buy one cable, cut it in half potentially, and have both sides covered rather than having to buy dedicated dual lower gyro cables or using more than one cable if you're going to make them yourself. So it goes without saying that I use standalone cable inners, the 1.6 millimeter variety that I talked about earlier, for the lower cable setup after I've gone ahead and made up the housing and the V-brake noodle setup for my lower cables. One other thing that's important to mention here is that this old Odyssey GTX gyro has a flat plate on the bottom where the lower inner cable goes, so I don't have to have the smaller end piece on it, and I can get away with using cables that have a normal end on them. If you're going to use the same cable setup I have here, you're going to want a gyro that allows you to have the set screws in it for the single inner dual upper gyro cable setup, and you're going to want something that allows you to use normal cable inners on the bottom rather than needing the smaller or spherical ended cables like some gyros require you to have. And if this is a problem for you, you can use derailleur cables for your cable inners on the bottom, but you need to keep in mind that they are thinner and they will break faster for you. That's why I ended up going with the thicker cables on the bottom. I used to use derailleur cables, but they broke so often that I got sick of it and just went with these thick cables, and now they last just about forever, especially with the setup that we're going to be talking about when we move a little further back. Now, this brings us to the London mod portion of my bike. A London mod is Odyssey's version of this setup. It's what allows you to use a single cable guide on your frame with dual lower gyro cables. This isn't the Odyssey London mod on here. This is actually, I think, a Primo one from like 10 years ago. It came on an old bike that I had. Just one of those sentimental things. Either way though, I've got the longer barrel adjusters here to give more adjustment for my cables, and I think that that just about does it when it comes to the London mod portion of my brakes. We can now move back to where the cables connect to the brake arms themselves. Okay, so before we talk about how the brake cables connect to the arms, let's talk about the brakes that I'm using. These are the Shadow Sano brakes, and I use these because both sides have a place for a Knarp rather than one side having a bolt through it which pinches the cable. And to talk about where the cables connect to the brake arms, let's take this Knarp out of the brake arm and give you a closer look. Okay, so we're focused in here and you can see that I have a Knarp, and then I have a straddle cable bolt setup. And if you're not familiar with this, the straddle cable bolt setup that I have here is the bolt that has a hole through the bolt itself, then two washers and a little nut. And this is pinching down on the cable. And the way that I have this run is that the cable comes through here, goes through the bolt, then loops through this Knarp, comes back through the bolt again, and then is pinched down with the nut in these two washers. And if you look at this Knarp, we don't have a screw in it and it moves freely. This is so that the point of contact with the brake arm is just a loop, and the point of friction and force that's keeping the brake cable in place isn't a pinch point on the cable. It's actually being compressed and pushed together with the washers and the bolt head. And as you can see here, the cable is in great condition, and this cable is actually pretty old As you can tell by the fact that it's bent several times because I've had to readjust where it sits in this loop for my brakes after the cable's stretched. These cables last so much longer with this setup that you really don't have to replace them very often or worry about them breaking at all, for that matter, because the point of contact is no longer a pinch point, it's a loop, and that just makes them last longer. They're more reliable that way, and you never have to be scared about dying on a brake trick because of your lower cables. If you have one of these bolts, chances are you'll probably have to drill it out thicker if you're using the thicker cable inners. It's very easy to do, very easy to set up. And once you're done, you just put the Knarp back in your brakes and everything works great. I have the exact same setup on both sides. This cable's a little bit frayed because I like to leave a lot of extra cable here for whatever reason. I just don't like the idea of it pulling through, even though it's never happened. This setup might not look as good as a traditional setup, but I can promise you after using it for over a year now, this setup lasts way longer than anything else I've ever used before. And I even think that the cable on the other side here is the original cable that I talked about in the video that I made where I first talked about this setup. And with that being said, we can move further back and past all of the tricks that I've done to make my brakes better and talk about the brake pads and the rim. So like I said before, I have the Shadow Sano brake arms, and for pads I'm using Odyssey clear pads, and for my rim I have a prototype Alienation Vandal rim which has an anodized coating of some sort on it, which makes my brakes absolutely amazing. I never have to clean the rim, the pads always work, and the brakes always stick 100% the way that they need to, and if they aren't, all I have to do is ride around for a little bit pulling the brakes and the rim cleans the pads off and makes the brakes work just as good as they would if I had a chrome rim and put some Simple Green or Pop or something sticky on the rim. So I absolutely recommend this rim with the Odyssey clear brake pads. And so with that being said, I think that's everything to do with my brake setup aside from spring tension and brake pad distance from the rim, both of which are subjective and up to personal preference. Some people like their brakes easy to pull, some people like them harder to pull, some people like a short brake pull, and some people like a long brake pull. Personally, I keep my spring tension somewhere right in the middle so that the brakes are still pretty easy to pull, but they come back pretty fast and with a little bit of force. And when it comes to brake pad distance from the rim, I keep that pretty close to the rim so that it's a relatively short brake pull. And when it comes to the pads and how they're orientated in relation to the rim, I keep them parallel to the rim so that the entire pad hits the rim at one time with seemingly one point of contact. This makes for a very solid brake pull that just feels like everything's hitting and stopping at one time and that you don't have to keep pulling once the brake pads hit the rim. And another thing worth mentioning when it comes to brake pads is that I run the bigger brake pad spacers between the brake arm and the brake pad itself so that the thinner ones are on the outside. This makes a greater distance between the rim and the brake arm, and I forget the logic behind that right now, but I know that there was something there and something that would make for an improvement over the thinner brake pad spacers being on the inside. So I'll make a video about that in the future. It's just something that I remembered and I wanted to include. So I think that's everything to do with my brake setup. I hope you find it useful. I've included all of the info cards and links in the description below for the videos that correspond with the different tips and tricks that I've done talking about brakes. Hopefully those help too. If so, leave some comments below. I'd like to hear your brake setups and how you set things up, and I'd like to know if any of these setups work for you or if you've tried them in general. With that being said, thank you for watching. I hope to hear about your brake setups in the comments below, whether it's your shoes or your brakes. Hit the subscribe button, it's free and there's no reason not to.